we are here, I think, and Ken Myers is here because of Leah, so Leah is the right person to introduce Mr. Myers. Thank you, Leah.
As Mr. Southgate just mentioned, Mr. Ken Myers currently is host and producer of Mars Hill Audio Journal, an audio magazine produced regularly since 1993 that seeks to produce creative audio resources that encourage Christians to grow in obedient wisdom concerning the cultural consequences of our duty to love God and neighbor. Mars Hill is not Mr. Myers' only experience with radio, however. Since he was 19, he has worked both for college radio and National Public Radio. Besides radio broadcasting, he was also formerly the editor of This World, Eternity, and Sections of Christianity Today. He has published a book entitled All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes, Christians and Popular Culture, and has written for numerous periodicals. Mr. Myers graduated from the University of Maryland, where he studied film theory and criticism, and from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, where he received a Master of Arts in Religion. He now lives with his wife in Central Virginia. Last year, I was honored to have Mr. Myers as advisor for my high school senior thesis project. On top of all of his regular work writing, speaking, editing, interviewing, and running a national publication, he fit in several lengthy phone calls and multiple emails to answer questions and edit my paper. I'm pleased to finally get to meet him, and I look forward to learning more from him today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Myers.
Thank you. I was thinking last night, before I gave the talk, that Friday night is the time to relax, and I didn't like to relax much, and that's not going to change. There's a line from, there's a Bette Davis line, fasten your seatbelt. I think she goes on to say it's going to be a bumpy evening. It's not going to be a bumpy morning, but we're going to address a few different concerns. Yesterday's talk was really about defining culture and engagement. Today we'll be looking at defining modern and secular, two important words that show up when we think about culture. Before I begin, though, I do want to, there's one thing I didn't get time to get to last night, and that was a few observations from Oliver O'Donovan, moral philosopher who was Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford for many years and then finished his career at Edinburgh. He's still writing and a very influential thinker in my own thinking. Remarkable man. His work is not as well known as it should be. One of his seminal books that came out, I think, in the 1980s was called Resurrection and Moral Order, which was an introduction to Christian ethics focusing on the consequences of the resurrection. And I read that with the recognition that I think for many Christians, the resurrection is kind of like an epilogue to the real accomplishment of redemption. Everything important happens on the cross, and oh yes, the third day he's raised from the dead to confirm the supernatural nature of what happened at Calvary. The idea that the resurrection in some way has a redemptive power to it as well tends to be neglected. I think this is also true of the incarnation. As I said yesterday, people think, well, the incarnation had to happen so that we could have the death on the cross. When I was at seminary at Westminster, one of my professors, Richard Gaffin, actually wrote a book on the centrality of the resurrection in the theology of Paul, which at the time was creating some waves because he was focusing on the resurrection to an extent that wasn't conventional in those circles. And O'Donovan similarly wants to focus our attention on the resurrection. And the reason I cite him here is because it has great consequences for how we understand the order of creation and God's care for the order of creation. I want to read a couple of short passages from his book. He first says, in proclaiming the resurrection of Christ, the apostles proclaimed also the resurrection of mankind in Christ. And in proclaiming the resurrection of mankind, they proclaimed the renewal of all creation with him. The resurrection of Christ in isolation from mankind would not be a gospel message. In other words, if we are not given life because of the resurrection, then that's just some weird anomaly that happened to this single person. The resurrection of mankind apart from creation would be a gospel of a sort, but a purely Gnostic and world-denying sort, which is far from the gospel that the apostles actually preached. So we could think of, human beings are given new life, but the creation is left behind, as it were. Sounds like a good title for a book. So the resurrection of Christ, O'Donovan says, directs our attention back to the creation which it vindicates. God's project of creation is not scrapped. Like I said, the stage set of creation isn't struck when we're saved and we can go on with a purely spiritual existence. We must, but, he says, the resurrection of Christ directs our attention back to the creation which it vindicates, but we must understand creation not merely as the raw material out of which the world as we know it was composed. It's not just the atomic elements there, but as the order and coherence in which it was composed. So it's the order of creation, not just the fact of creation, not just the mere material presence of things. Earlier in this book, actually, O'Donovan had observed that in the resurrection of Christ, who is the God-man, the resurrection is the raising of the last Adam, in whom the fullness of the Godhead assumed bodily form. And there we have a vantage point to understand God's creative and redemptive work together. He says, from the resurrection, we look back to the created order that's being vindicated in the resurrection, but also look forwards to our eschatological participation in that order. So it's not just the recovery of something that's lost, but we're looking forward to new life that has expanded ramifications. O'Donovan also writes that in speaking of Christ as the resurrected Lord of creation, so far from overpowering the given order of things, Christ rescued it from the emptiness into which it had fallen. And there he's referring to Romans 8:20-21. His redemptive love thus fulfilled the creative task of Adam to call things by their proper names. And here O'Donovan is referring to the fact that Adam is given this naming task, which is a vocation of perceiving the nature of creatures, and thus he seals the divinely appointed reality, what these creatures are, what their nature is. He gives them a name. Christ completes that task. As O'Donovan says, his authority over nature and his salvific concern for the true being of nature go together inseparably. He's taking this out of the identity of Christ as the last Adam or the second Adam. Okay, today, as I said, we're going to talk about the meaning of the word modern and the meaning of the word secular. You and I don't live in culture. We live in a culture. We don't live in an abstraction called culture. We live in a very specific culture. But there are still some Christians who speak as if the way to be faithful was to expel all cultural things from a life of faith. That the problems we have is culture is an enemy. Culture as such is an enemy. And they give the impression that it would be possible for believers to live free from the influence of culture, which is like saying that we could have a way of life. We could live without having a way of life, in other words. I think that something like that assumption may have influenced early 20th century fundamentalists in their flight from cultural involvement, rather than recognizing that the challenge to their faithfulness lay in a disordered culture. That is, the specific culture they were in was terribly confused and disordered. They mistakenly embraced the prejudice against culture as such, and that's still evident. I heard Andy Crouch, who wrote a book called Culture Making, give a talk not long ago in which he reproduced a full-page ad from a Christian magazine that very strongly, I can't remember exactly how it was worded, but very strongly gave the impression that culture as such is a corrosive force in Christian faith. And I think that many early 20th century fundamentalists attempted to erect a wall to keep out undesirable influences from culture, with the assumption being that culture as such was secular, and secular meant godless. And the wall that was erected was erected because it was assumed that the sacred, if we're going to preserve a realm of life of holiness, we have to preserve the sacred from the secular. That's a fascinating claim. That's exactly what the ACLU wants to do. It's interesting that the fundamentalists were on the side of the secularists in assuming that the secular and the sacred should be kept separate. And what I want to argue later is that it's precisely that division between secular and sacred that was the problem. But fundamentalism actually reinforced that division. That anti-cultural impulse is still alive among some American Christians, and while I sympathize with their zeal for faithfulness, I'm afraid that their strategy is naive, and, as I've suggested, it ironically shares some remarkable similarities to the views of their adversaries. All faith must take cultural form because we're not disembodied beings. We live in communities, we live in space and time, we live in specific places in history, and that's as true of Christians as it is of all human persons. The church is not an acultural or an anti-cultural body. It's really the culture of modernity that champions the idea that we could live as if we were outside of history somehow, that we don't have a past. American culture expresses that idea of historylessness better than any Western culture. There was a book written in 1955 called American Adam by literary critic R.W.B. Lewis. It was a study of 19th century American literature. And in that title, American Adam, Americans are people without belly buttons. In other words, Americans think of themselves as sprung from nowhere. He says, in America we witness the rise of a radically new personality, the hero of the new adventure, an individual emancipated from history, happily bereft of ancestry, untouched and undefiled by the usual inheritances of family and race. An individual standing alone, self-reliant and self-propelling, ready to confront whatever awaited him with the aid of his own unique and inherent resources. America, Lewis wrote, since the age of Emerson, has been persistently a one-generation culture. In America, society seems to live from hand to mouth like an army in the field. I mean, this is a great American myth. Horatio Alger among them. Starting fresh. And part of it's tied to our immigrant history. But the idea that you can start from nowhere and have no ancestry, have no past, have no history. Now there's a minority voice and there's a lot of fiction written also that suggests the futility of that effort to live as if we're in a world without fathers. And the irony is that the assumption that we can be, on the dollar bill, novus ordo seclorum, the new order of the ages, that we can start from nowhere and reinvent ourselves and reinvent our country. That, oddly enough, that's actually a tradition in America now. Our anti-traditionalism has become our tradition. And it's really the tradition of modernity. It's a paradox in the fact that modernity is all about starting from, it's an addiction to the new, and the assumption that we can dispense with the old, and aren't tied to the old in any way. Oddly enough, that has become our tradition. So I want to talk a little bit here now about the meaning of the modern. Before I do that, I want to talk about how difficult it is to discern the signs of the times that we live in. I mean, some people have suggested that we can never detach ourselves enough from our cultural moment to actually understand the meaning of our cultural moment. O'Donovan, again, has written that there is plenty to show that those who do not make an effort to read their times in a disciplined way read them all the same, but with a narrow and parochial prejudice. So if you don't work hard to try to understand your times, and with a particular discipline, you still will try to assess the nature of the times you're living in, the spirit of the age, but you probably do it really badly. And a lot of the work I've been doing for 30-some years is based on a concern for promoting a disciplined understanding of the cultural trends of our times. And O'Donovan helpfully summarizes some of the characteristics. What would a disciplined study of our era require? He says, first of all, we need to see the marks of our time as the products of our past. What's happening now is really the fruition, the fruit of something that happened a while ago. We also need, he writes, to notice the danger that civilization poses to itself, not only the danger of barbarian reaction. So what is it in the structure of our own civilization that actually has a destructive tendency? And then the last point, we need to attend especially not to those features which strike our contemporaries as controversial, but to those which would have astonished an onlooker from the past, but which seemed to us too obvious to question. Now, I often see this, a lot of Christians, again, well-intentioned Christians, who pick up on cultural problems that everybody can see, and they align themselves with progressive or reforming cultural movements concerning which, a subject concerning which there's almost unanimous assent. Yes, this is a problem. And they neglect to recognize, as he puts it, the things which would have astonished an onlooker from the past. What is it about our culture that everybody takes for granted that's actually the source of our problem? C.S. Lewis, several places, says a very similar thing. In his essay, you may be familiar with it, called On the Reading of Old Books. Lewis made a similar comment about how understanding our own age requires an effort to avoid the blind spots that are typical of our age. We need to disengage from our culture enough to see what it is it's seeing. And he writes, every age has its own outlook. It is specifically good at seeing certain truths and specifically liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. And then he says, somewhat playfully, to be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get at them. So he doesn't want to idealize the past. He does want some point of reference against which we can compare the present, and we don't have access to some time travel to read the books of the 23rd century and thereby dispel ourselves of our blind spots. So we'll have to rely on the 18th and 19th or 12th or 13th century. In his address, Learning in Wartime, he says something very similar. It's one of my favorite of Lewis's essays, originally given as a sermon in Oxford in 1939. He says, we need intimate knowledge of the past. Not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future and yet need something to set against the present to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated today is merely temporary fashion. He's actually, the reason he mentions the uneducated, he's talking about the vocation of scholars. One of the gifts that scholars bring to their culture is an awareness of the past, which uneducated people who haven't had time or inclination to study the past, don't have access to it. They think the newspapers or blogs, to be anachronistic here, will tell them what they need to know. And so this is one of the reasons why Learning in Wartime, he's in that sermon, he's defending the vocation of scholarship while people are out dying in the front. He says, a man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own age. Now we can only ever step outside the prejudices of our own age so far. It's difficult to do. It does require a lot of discipline. We can never entirely escape the effects of our own enculturation, but we can use various tools to try to do so to some extent, tools taken from different intellectual disciplines. And in my own study, I've relied on tools both from sociology and from philosophy and theology to try to understand the peculiarities of our time. Modernity can be described in sociological terms. We could talk about what's distinctive in modern culture by focusing on the configuration of social institutions and the kinds of concerns and convictions that modern social institutions tend to promote. And modernity can be described, that's the sociology side. Modernity can also be described in terms of the ideas that animate modern societies, and that would be the philosophy and theology side. But of course, the ideas, as I tried to make clear last night, the ideas and the social configurations of institutions have a symbiotic relationship. Some people rely solely on the history of ideas without attending to how the ideas are transmitted and made plausible by our social experience. Other people focus solely on sociological factors and ignore or downplay the profound philosophical and theological changes that modernity displays. And I think to understand our time, we really need both. Now, two Christian thinkers who've applied sociological tools to understand modernity that have helped me, especially as someone who, as I began to ask these questions, Os Guinness, who you may know Os's work, and James Davison Hunter. Guinness's best work along this line dates back to the 80s and 90s, and his work since then has addressed other kinds of questions. Hunter has been working within the academic world and has continued to apply sociological tools to understanding our moment. Os Guinness, I think my favorite book of his that helped in this direction was probably his least popular book. I think he told me once how disappointed he was at the sales of this book, a book called The Gravedigger Files, subtitled Papers on the Subversion of the Modern Church. And a lot of you have read the Screwtape Letters. Screwtape Letters is letters from a senior tempter to his apprentice. The Gravedigger Files are allegedly a collection of memoranda between various bureaucrats who are undermining the effectiveness of the church by basically enabling the church to dig its own grave by striving to be really relevant. And basically, he's looking at ways in which American Christians, particularly American evangelicals, were failing to understand how many of their ideas and their institutions had been profoundly shaped by the culture around them. And this was a way of digging their own graves, he argues. In 1993, he followed up that book with a book with the sinister title, Dining with the Devil, subtitled, The Megachurch Movement Flirts with Modernity. And he was much more focused. I think he figured people weren't getting the point in the early book, so he thought, I'm going to hit you over the head with a hammer here. The megachurch movement is dining with the devil. Os Guinness was very much influenced by the work of Peter Berger, prominent American sociologist who focused his work on an approach to understanding sociology which has been described as the sociology of knowledge. In sociology of knowledge, scholars try to discern how certain beliefs, certain ideas, become more or less plausible under certain social conditions. I remember Berger once commenting that Mormonism is much more plausible in Salt Lake City than it is in Manhattan. It's not necessarily more credible, but it's more plausible. And by distinguishing between credible and plausible, he meant that if you just abstracted the ideas out of their cultural context, that's how you look at credibility. Is this something that's believable? But the plausibility is conferred by social institutions and experience. If most of the people around you, or a lot of people around you, are committed Mormons and wonderful people who enrich the life of the community, it's easier to find Mormonism plausible in that setting than it would be in Manhattan, where one assumes there aren't as many Mormons and they're not as thick on the ground in Manhattan. Let me give another example. Living in a society in which everyone drives in a personally owned automobile conveys a different set of intuitions about freedom and community than would be conveyed in a society where everyone relies on mass transit. And sociology of knowledge looks at how changes that are conferred by technologies or by economic changes or even by climate affect the plausibility of certain sets of ideas. I remember the first time I went to Southern California and just was enjoying this really nice weather, having lived in the Northeast earlier, and I think, man, I wouldn't bother studying theology if I lived here. It was just too nice. Forget that, dude. Beliefs are embraced or assumed not because they're examined dispassionately and judged to be true, but because they feel plausible. We as human beings, that's how we assess things. They fit with a way of life shared by most people. They're conventional. And it's difficult to affirm things that are unconventional. This is why I think the church needs conventions that sustain the plausibility of what we believe, not just as an act of obedience, but as an act of conveying our convictions to ourselves and to our children. James Hunter, also very influenced by Peter Berger. He actually studied with Peter Berger at Rutgers University, and one of his first books looked at how American evangelicals were in many ways captive to the dynamics of modernity. That book, as did the Gravedigger Files, also appeared in 1983. It was called American Evangelicalism, Conservative Religion, and the Quandary of Modernity. And in it, Hunter described modernity not principally by its distinctive beliefs, but also by its social characteristics. I'll read quickly a part of the paragraph. Modern societies, and this gives the flavor of a sociological approach to culture. Modern societies are characterized by a population concentrated in urban areas. There's a highly intensified division of labor, as well as a high degree of institutional specialization and segmentation. The economic sphere is based on a highly sophisticated technology. Social relationships are largely impersonal and arbitrary. The primary mode of social organization in all spheres is bureaucratic, hence impersonal and kind of mechanical. Political power is at least ideologically based in the populace. Now, these are all sociological, not philosophical observations. There's about the external structure of things. The point he makes is, the point that whole discipline makes is, living in a society structured this way lends plausibility to certain ways of understanding reality rather than others. And the Christian faith in particular, at many points, is more difficult to believe in a modern, mechanized, technological, bureaucratic society than it is in a pre-modern society where you don't have the level of fragmentation. And again, I won't go into all the details. That book, I don't know if it's still in print or not, but it's still, I think, relevant. Another book I will mention quickly by a third sociologist, also influenced by Berger, Craig Gay, who is I think he's still at Regent College up in BC. A book called The Way of the Modern World. Modern's actually in parentheses. The Way of the Modern World. Subtitled Why It's Tempting to Live as If God Doesn't Exist. And he looks, again, at the sociological characteristics of modern culture and looks at why modernity promotes a de facto atheism. That even Christians live their lives in public as if God doesn't exist in modernity. That's just kind of, it's very tempting to do that. The work of sociologists like Guinness and Hunter and Gay and many others are very helpful in diagnosing how modern ideas are embedded in and conveyed by modern social institutions, which I think is very instructive for Christians. Because if we're trying to advance a different set of ideas and commitments, then we can't adopt all of the institutions of modernity as if they were innocent and perfectly adaptable to our purposes, and just slap put an ichthus on them to kind of Christianize them. They're tools, the structures that we have are tools that are more consistent with a particular way of understanding reality than others. But a sociological analysis of modernity while very, very helpful, it's inadequate to explain exactly what is wrong about many distinctively modern ideas. We also need insights from philosophy and theology to get a summary picture of what makes modern culture different and deficient. Now, the best sociologists, including the three that I mentioned, all often go beyond the limits of their discipline and get into philosophical and theological matters. So I won't exclude their testimony in my effort to deepen our understanding of the challenges of living in the modern world. Another sociologist who's now at Notre Dame, Christian Smith, he wrote a book, I'm blanking on the exact title, but it was The Meaning of the Person, or may have been the title. But it was about what does it mean to be a human person? And he ends up thinking, well, he looks at 28 different characteristics of human personhood, and the highest of these, he puts them in a hierarchy. The highest is love. Well, when a sociologist begins talking about love, he was really criticized by a lot of his colleagues. They said, well, you're going beyond the limits of your discipline. You're no longer talking as a sociologist now. But the best sociologists don't talk just like sociologists. And I will cite some of them here. I said last night, I think I said last night, but that when I use the word modern, I don't just mean contemporary. That modern means more than that. It's more substantive. It's not just a chronological adjective. And one of the defining characteristics of modern Western culture, that's evident in its artifacts and the pattern of practices and institutions, is the belief that there's no intrinsic meaning in the universe. There's nothing that it's an essentially materialistic view in that the universe doesn't contain meaning, but we can ascribe meaning to it. And some Christians believe this as well, I think. Some Christians believe that we ascribe meaning to the stuff of creation. All of the physical stuff of creation. But it's not intrinsic to it. Sociologist Daniel Bell, a non-believer, argues that to be modern is to embrace the proposition that there are no ends or purposes given in nature, that the individual and his or her self-realization is the new standard of judgment, and that one can remake oneself and remake society in an effort to achieve the goals of self-realization. So rather than individual selves striving to conform themselves to the shape of reality, in modernity, we try to remake reality to fit our desires. That's, in a sense, a summary statement. That's kind of a paraphrase of a line from C.S. Lewis's The Evolution of Man. The reigning belief of modern culture is that each individual is the sovereign maker of meaning. And that can be asserted precisely because of, on the flip side, there is no meaning out there intrinsically in nature. Where pre-modern cultures assumed a creator and governor who established cosmic order, a cosmic order to which human societies and individuals must conform. Modern culture denies the existence of such an order and encourages each individual to assert his or her own order. And we see that in multiple ways, and we see it in more extreme ways. And probably we'll see it in still more extreme ways. Until that basic premise, there is no meaning in the nature of things, is significantly challenged. That organizing idea of modernity has a lot of prominent cultural consequences. The most dramatic of these is the radical reorientation of the purpose of cultural institutions. Historically, cultural institutions serve to establish boundaries for belief and behavior based on assumptions about the nature of things. Social institutions were sustained, like social institutions like marriage, was based on an assumption about the nature of things and established boundaries for behavior. But since in the modern understanding there is no nature of things to guide us, and since self-realization of the individual, who is a sovereign, willing self, is the highest good, then our cultural institutions have gradually shifted over to become agents not of permission and prohibition, not defining boundaries, not establishing guardrails, But our institutions exist for the sake of extending freedom and choice to individuals. Cultural institutions now serve to equip each individual with as much freedom and power as possible so as to assert his or her own account of meaning. Pre-modern cultures were systems of restraint. Modern culture is a system of liberation. And that's not accidental. It's tied to the philosophical understanding, theological understanding of what the nature of reality is. This characteristic of modern culture led sociologist Philip Reeve, in his book The Triumph of the Therapeutic, to characterize modern culture as, somewhat paradoxically, an anti-culture. That is, it's doing exactly the opposite of what cultures historically have done. Others have declared that we live in a post-cultural time, which is, again, somewhat paradoxical. In a society of sovereign individuals, culture becomes less and less a communal way of life sustained across generations. It's now an optional, individually selected lifestyle. The one thing that unites our culture is this commitment to freedom and the denial of intrinsic meaning in the order of things. Outside of that, that's the only rule. It's a big rule. It's a big rule, but it basically trumps all other rules. Sorry for using that verb. Haven't broken the habit. In modernity, culture discards its concern for sustaining normative, objective order and promotes the individual creation of meaning. It's meaningful for me, and that's the most important thing. Or at least experiences that feel vaguely meaningful, if not fully meaningful. So freedom becomes a driving concern in modern culture. And the understanding of freedom is very different. Freedom is present in other cultures. It's in the Bible. But in the pre-modern West, freedom meant the ability to live in accord with the objective order of creation. When Jesus says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free," you become free by acknowledging what is true. You become free by living in accordance with the grain of the universe, as it were. Our view, our view is you will be free and you will discover the truth, whatever truth you want, and your freedom is guaranteed by the force of government to be free to discover the truth in your own way. So freedom is an important concern in the New Testament, but the freedom envisioned there is very different from modern freedom. It's a freedom to be liberated from the restraint, from the disordering effects of sin, and to be free who we were created to be. To be free in the older view was to be free from the bondage of one's own passions. But in modern culture, freedom requires the social and psychic space to indulge one's passions, which by and large are self-justifying. If they're my passions, then they are good. Another dominant characteristic of modern culture, and again it's tied to this idea of freedom and self-definition, which again is the flip side of the denial of meaning in the nature of things. If nature has no nature, then it's just a lot of raw material that we can control for fulfilling our own desires. And so, since we don't live in a meaningfully ordered creation, we're living in a shapeless mass of raw materials that we call nature, then there's no inherent limit to what we might do to or with nature. So human bodies become just raw material for experiments that satisfy our desires in some way. And we can transcend it. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the so-called transhumanists or extropians. These are people who believe that human nature as we inherited is pretty lame, and that we could do a much better job with drugs and cyborg implants and all sorts of other things to create human nature 2.0. Because actually, hey, there's nothing intrinsic about the body, there's nothing intrinsic about human nature as we know it. That's just an accident of an inherently meaningless natural order. So now that we're in control, we can create a better understanding of human nature, and each individual can create human nature in accordance with their own desires. this is, in the reading and interviewing I've done for the last 25 years, I've marveled at the extent to which this quick summary, or this short summary of the characteristics of modernity is shared by scholars across disciplinary lines, across theological and philosophical lines. This is what it means to be modern. Oliver O'Donovan, in a book of his called The Desire of the Nations, talks about all of the different critics of modernity. And he says, among all of them, there's a theme that recurs persistently, and it centers on the notion of the human will exercising choice without reference to any kind of order that precedes the choosing. And corresponding to this transcendent will, he says, is an inner nature that lacks any given order that would make it good before we begin to do something to it. He says, to put it theologically, the paradigm for our presence in the world is creation ex nihilo. Creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing was the phrase that summarized God's own work of creation. There's nothing there until God calls being into being. Well, for modernity, there's nothing meaningful there until we are the makers. We have the power of creation ex nihilo. We create out of nothing because there's nothing that precedes our own willing. And this, again, is a common testimony. C.S. Lewis, an essay he wrote in 1943 called The Poison of Subjectivism. Until modern times, no thinker of the first rank ever doubted that our judgments of value were rational judgments, or that what they discovered was objective. It was taken for granted, for instance, that in temptation, passion was opposed to reason. The modern view is very different. It does not believe that value judgments are really judgments at all. They're just sentiments or complexes or attitudes. They're feelings. Value judgments are just feelings. They're expressions of preference. To say that a thing is good is merely to express our feeling about it, and our feeling about it is the feeling that we've been socially conditioned to have. I've got a number of other citations from Lewis and from David Bentley Hart and from other scholars to summarize this characteristic of modernity. And I don't know how many of you, when you hear the word modern culture, think about modern culture. This may be an entirely new thing to you. I imagine it makes sense because I think the signs of this are obvious. But I'm not sure that it's something that we're that most people are consciously aware of. Now, I want to jump ahead to a discussion of the word secular. In this modern view, if there is no good that precedes our willing, then society needs to order itself to protect the sovereign willing of each individual person. So there can't be any kind of restriction, either from government or from even family or church, on each individual's defining the reality the way they want to. And particularly in public life, religious claims have to be kept out of public. It's somewhat paradoxical to say that theological concerns have no business in ordering public life, which I think is just generally accepted by most modern Western people. Because to say that theological concerns have no business in ordering public life is itself a theologically loaded claim, because it presupposes certain things, certain theological things about the nature of human persons, the nature of human community, what the public is. Those are really ultimately questions that have a theological component to them. So it's not a neutral claim. And part of what I think we need to do is to destroy the idea of the neutrality of the claim that religion is entirely private. The idea that we can think about the question of the role of religious belief in public life without asking theological questions about the nature of religion, what the church is and should do, what religion is, how it should influence our lives, what human flourishing should look like. These are all assumed to be neutral political and not theological matters, but they're not, they're theological matters. And nobody knows this better than serious Muslims, by the way. Serious Muslims realize that the First Amendment, the prohibition on Congress making laws involving the establishment of religion, that's not a neutral view of religion. That's not a view that accords with Islam. But we think it's neutral because we've accepted this modern notion of the secular. In modern societies, it's typically assumed that there's a neat separation between the sacred and the secular. And citizens of liberal democracy speak of them as if they're two separate spaces. It's not just a division between church and state, it's a division between the sacred and the secular. We need a division between church and state because of the fact that there are two spheres of life, two zones of life that work in accordance with different principles. One of those spheres, one of those zones involves the spiritual life, the others involve material aspects of our existence. In the one region, faith will provide guidance, in the other, reason rules. The sacred concerns the supernatural, and on the other side of the wall of separation, everything is understood in purely natural terms. We can't let the supernatural, or any supernatural explanations, intervene in how we conduct civic affairs. And we expect that theologians will discuss redemption in the sacred space. And if those theologians are ever granted a visa or visitation rights to visit the secular territory, they can only talk about creation, and then only if they